Ethan Miller stood on the frosted platform of Sagebrush Station with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. He told himself the trembling came from the cold, but he knew it came from the fear sitting heavy in his chest. The train from the east was slowing to a stop, steel wheels grinding through the winter wind. Months ago, he had placed a simple ad asking for a wife willing to live far from town. It felt easy when he wrote it. Now it felt like the biggest gamble of his life. The whistle echoed across the empty stretch of land, sharp enough to make his breath catch. The passenger door clanged open, and a small gloved hand gripped the rail. Ethan froze for one long moment. He had imagined this meeting 100 different ways, but none of those daydreams prepared him for the truth. He was a quiet rancher with a half-finished home in long winters that tested a man's spirit. If she stepped off the train, took one look at him, and turned back around, he would not blame her. Snow swirled under the depot lamp, lighting his worn boots and the rough stubble on his jaw. Sagebrush Station was nothing more than a store, a saloon, and the depot itself. 3 days before Christmas in 1886, the whole place felt trapped in deep silence, like the land was holding its breath. Then she stepped down. Leah Dawson wore a dark blue traveling dress, her coat too thin for the frontier air, and snow dusted the edges of her bonnet. She held a carpet bag close to her side like it carried everything she owned. Her eyes found Ethan and stayed there. Something in her steady gaze softened the tightness in his chest. He took off his hat and greeted her with a slow nod. He carried her trunk to the wagon, lifted it with a strength that came from long days of work, and offered her his hand to help her up. Her grip was firm even through her gloves. When she settled beside him on the wooden wagon seat, the space felt smaller than he expected. They rolled out of town with the horses pushing warm breath into the air. Ethan handed her a wool blanket he kept under the seat, and she draped it over her legs without hesitation. She studied the land as though she wanted to memorize everything in one long look. The wide fields stretched quiet and white, broken only by lines of dark timber. After a minute, she said the land felt wider than she imagined. Her voice carried awe tucked beneath her nerves. Ethan told her that winter had a way of changing the land without warning. She asked what work came first at his place, and he felt a small warmth settle in his chest at the question. She asked like she already meant to take part in whatever waited for them. He told her they needed wood, water, and careful watching of the animals. She listened as though each detail mattered. A mile later, she asked why he wrote the ad in the first place. Ethan respected her straightforwardness. He told her he was tired of going entire days without another voice in the room. He told her he felt like he was fading into the quiet. She did not laugh or look away. She nodded like someone who knew something about long nights. They shared small pieces of their past as the wagon climbed into the pines. Ethan told her he left his family ranch years back when it became clear there was nothing left for him there. Leah told him she lost her parents young and spent years working wherever she could, never staying long. He gave her his spare coat when the cold thickened, and she accepted it without pride or apology. When the wagon reached his cabin, Leah stared at it with wide, shining eyes. The place sat against a rocky slope for protection, smoke drifting from the chimney in a thin ribbon. The barn beside it leaned a little, but held itself together. Ethan waited for disappointment, but instead she let out a breathy laugh, half relief and half disbelief. She whispered, "It looked real," and he felt something inside him loosen. Inside, the warmth of the stove and the simple smell of beans greeted them. Ethan showed her where he kept the water bucket, the flour, the coffee, and the small cot near the stove he planned to take so she could have the bed. He stayed close to the door, trying not to crowd her. Late afternoon slipped into a gray evening, and snow began falling in thick waves. Somewhere beyond the pines, a lone wolf called out. The sound tightened the muscles in Ethan's neck. The wind picked up, hitting the cabin walls with a deeper, more urgent tone. He listened and knew the storm forming outside was no small one. A sudden bang rattled the air. Something out by the barn had come loose in the rising wind. Ethan handed Leah the rope line and explained she would need it if the snow grew too heavy to see through. A hard gust slammed the cabin again. He grabbed his coat and told her they had to move fast. She pulled on her gloves without question. When he opened the door, winter slammed into them like a force trying to push them back inside. Snow flew along the floor and melted near the stove. Ethan gripped the rope and stepped into the storm. Laya held the rope with one hand and the back of his belt with the other, just like he told her. The world outside had turned white. Sky, ground, and distance had merged into one endless blur. Ethan pushed forward, boots sinking deep into fast-growing drifts. His breath burned in the cold air, and his fear rose with each step, not for himself, but for the woman trusting him with her life. His glove finally struck solid wood. Relief hit him so fast he almost fell forward. Together, they fought the frozen latch until it gave, and they stumbled into the barn. The warm breath of horses filled the space, their bodies shifting nervously. Ethan lit the lantern and moved down the line of stalls, checking hooves and legs, brushing frost from their coats. Laya worked beside him, breaking ice in the trough, her breath shaking but her hands steady. When they made their way back to the cabin, snow clung to their clothes and cold water soaked through their sleeves. Inside, Ethan fed the stove until it glowed hot. Laya held her hands toward the heat and whispered she thought she understood winter before today. Ethan told her the frontier had its own lessons. If this story is touching your heart already, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and if you have ever gone through something similar. Also, tell me what you would like me to improve in future stories. The storm deepened through the night, pressing against the cabin walls with a weight that made the wood groan. Ethan listened to the wind shift pitch and knew it was turning dangerous. The frontier taught a man to hear trouble before it arrived. Laya sat at the table, unwrapping her scarf, her cheeks still flushed from the cold. She kept glancing toward the door like she was measuring the force of the storm with nothing more than instinct. Ethan checked the shutters and the stove, then the rope line once more. Outside, the snow beat against the door like a steady fist. Laya watched him as he moved, and after a moment she spoke. Her voice was soft but steady when she asked if the storm could get worse. Ethan gave her the truth. It might. Winters here had a way of turning without warning, and this wind felt like one that meant business. A heavy crack from outside made both of them jump. It wasn't the wind this time. It came from the barn. Ethan grabbed their coats, but before he could step out, he pressed the end of the rope line into Laya's hands and told her how to use it. She nodded once, pulled her gloves tight, and followed him to the door. When he opened it, snow poured in like a wave. The cold bit at their faces so sharply it felt like needles. Ethan leaned into the wind and guided Laya forward along the rope. She held his belt with one hand, the line with the other. The world around them had vanished into a thick, shifting white. The storm swallowed every shape, every shadow. Ethan counted each step in his head, even though he didn't realize he was doing it. His fist finally hit the barn wall. He felt the rough wood through his glove and nearly sagged against it with relief. Leela leaned into him for a moment, catching her breath. Together, they forced the latch open and stumbled inside. The drop-in noise felt like stepping into another world, a world made of warm animal breath and lantern glow. The horses snorted and paced. Their hides were damp from fear and cold. Ethan checked them one by one, running his hands down each leg, calming them with a steady tone. Laya helped without being told. She cracked the ice on the trough until dark water showed beneath. She checked the chickens through the small back door and found them huddled under straw. She held up a warm egg with a look on her face like it mattered more than food. Ethan didn't tease her. He understood what small signs of life meant inside a storm like this. Another loud bang shook the barn wall. Ethan found a loose shutter where a nail had been pulled free by the wind. He held the board in place while Laya pressed her shoulder against it. Snowflakes swirled through the gap until Ethan drove the nail tight. When the shutter stopped rattling, he turned to her and saw how pale she'd become. Still, she didn't complain. The walk back to the cabin was harder. Snow clung to their coats, melting through and chilling their backs. The wind shoved them sideways more than once. Laya stumbled, but Ethan steadied her with a firm grip at her elbow. Twice he stopped to make sure she hadn't gone numb. When the cabin finally appeared as a dark rectangle in the white, Ethan pushed the door open and ushered her inside. The warmth hit them in a rush. Laya peeled off her wet gloves and held her hands toward the stove, breathing deep as the fire brought feeling back to her fingers. Ethan hung their coats to dry and poured hot coffee into tin cups. She accepted hers with both hands, still shaking slightly. After a long sip, she whispered that this place was wilder than she ever imagined. Ethan said winter out here played by its own rules. He showed her how to melt snow properly so it turned into real water instead of vapor. He talked through the supplies they had and the chores waiting for daylight. Laya listened closely, asking only what mattered. When he explained they would need to check the barn often during the storm, she nodded and said she would take one of the shifts. Ethan wanted to refuse, but he saw her determination. He agreed on the condition. She followed his instructions exactly. Hours passed, and the storm only grew louder. Near midnight, Ethan reached for his coat for that first night check, and Laya stood to follow. Her boot caught the rug, and before either of them could react, she stumbled. She grabbed the table, but her foot twisted hard under her. The sound of it turning made her gasp and freeze in place. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his heart hammering. He eased her boot off gently and pressed along the swelling bone. Heat rose beneath his fingers. Laya clenched her jaw, refusing to cry out, though pain tightened her face. Ethan wrapped the ankle in cloth, then braced it with a thin board and cord he found near the stove. His hands worked calm and steady, though fear tugged at him beneath the surface. When Laya tried to stand, she cried out softly despite trying not to. Ethan caught her and guided her into the chair. Outside, the wind slammed the cabin again. Something cracked against the wall. The lantern flickered. Ethan looked toward the door, then back at her swollen ankle. The barn still needed checking. The storm hadn't eased at all. He lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bed. He tucked quilts around her legs and raised the injured ankle on a folded blanket to slow the swelling. She tried to sit up. Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder and told her firmly to stay put. He gathered his coat and lantern, wrapped his scarf around his mouth, and paused by the door. Laya's eyes followed him. Full of fear, she tried hard to hide. He promised he would be back soon and told her to keep the fire alive. Her chin trembled, but she nodded. Stepping into the storm alone felt like stepping into a world stripped of direction. The cold hit him so fast it stole his breath. He gripped the rope line and leaned into the wind. Each step felt heavier than the last. Snow stung his face, and the rope stiffened with ice. When he finally reached the barn, he realized he had been holding his breath. Inside, he checked the horses, the cows, and the small flock. Everything held for now. Returning to the cabin took every bit of strength he had left. When he pushed through the door, Laya was awake in the chair, her injured leg propped up, and a kettle steaming on the stove. She looked at him like she had been waiting for that exact moment. Relief softened her whole face. Ethan leaned against the door, trying to gather himself. Laya didn't ask if he was hurt. She simply asked whether the animals were safe. He told her they were. She nodded and finally relaxed her shoulders. The long night ahead would test them both, but Ethan saw something in Laya that eased a worry he didn't know he'd been holding. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't running. She was here with him. The next day rose without sunlight, just a dull gray glow through the shutters that told Ethan the storm had settled in for the long haul. The wind still pressed against the cabin, though its voice had changed. It no longer screamed. It growled low, steady, and unending. Ethan moved quietly around the room, careful not to disturb Laya as she slept. Her breathing was slow and steady, though the bruising around her ankle had darkened overnight. He checked the wrap, adjusted the blanket, and eased a sigh through his nose. They were only at the start of this. He brewed coffee and fed the stove until the fire reached a good, honest heat. When Laya woke, she tried to sit up on her own, but pain stiffened her face before she even swung her legs over the bed. Ethan steadied her and helped her into the chair by the fire. She thanked him with a tired voice. trying to sound stronger than she felt. He admired that about her. She never folded under fear. She bent, but she didn't break. Outside, the world was swallowed by white. The storm had piled snow against the cabin wall so high it reached halfway up the shutters. Ethan knew the barn roof would be under twice that weight. He ate a cold biscuit while thinking through everything that needed doing. Then he bundled up and stepped outside for the first daylight check. Snow came up past his knees. Heavy and slow, the rubber line guided him like a lifeline. Reaching the barn felt like emerging into air after staying underwater too long. Inside, the animals shifted nervously. Their breaths steamed. Their bodies twitched from tension. Ethan soothed them the best he could, breaking ice in the trough, spreading hay in thick lines, checking hooves one by one. His hands went numb more than once, but he kept working until the barn felt steady again. He returned to the cabin, windburned and dizzy from the cold. Laya was waiting near the stove. She had pulled her chair close enough to keep the kettle simmering. She'd organized the shelf, swept the floor with the little broom Ethan kept behind the door, and set aside supplies that needed rationing. She worked through the pain in her ankle, but the tightness in her jaw told Ethan every move cost her something. She offered him hot coffee, and he accepted it with grateful hands. They talked quietly while the storm pushed against the walls. Laya said she never imagined silence could have weight to it. Ethan said winter here could make a place feel like the edge of the world. That night the storm returned to its full strength. The wind slammed the roof with a force that made the rafters creak like old bones. Ethan made the night check alone again. Laya insisted she could help, but he shut that down fast. She glared at him, but didn't argue. He stepped into the storm with the rope line in hand and the lantern tucked under his coat. By the time he returned, ice had frozen in his eyelashes, and his fingers barely worked enough to unhook the latch. Laya was waiting for him again, worry plain on her face. She helped him peel off his soaked coat, then guided him toward the stove without needing to be asked. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The danger outside filled all the space between words. By the second night, exhaustion clung to Ethan's shoulders like extra weight. Laya saw it before he admitted it. When he reached for the cot near the stove, she shook her head and said the bed was big enough for both of them if they kept a boundary between. Ethan almost refused, then felt his knees tremble. He needed real sleep. He rolled a quilt and laid it between them like a divider. They settled under the blankets, both facing opposite sides of the bed, stiff as wood. The storm hammered the cabin again, and their breathing filled the quiet between gusts. Near midnight, Laya called Ethan's name softly. He answered, half awake, but alert. She asked why he really wrote the ad. Her voice carried something honest and raw beneath the question. Ethan stared into the dark for a while before answering. He told her he felt like a man disappearing in his own life. He said the silence in his old cabin had grown so thick, it felt like it might swallow him whole if he didn't do something. Laya didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice shook in a way that didn't sound like fear. She said she'd lived among crowds her whole life, yet never felt like she belonged anywhere. At least out here, she said. The loneliness was honest. Something eased in Ethan's chest at her words. He fell asleep with that thought warming him more than the blankets. The storm did not lift on the third day. Snow packed itself higher around the cabin until Ethan had to dig the door free each morning. His hands cracked from cold and every breath burned in his chest. Laya kept the fire alive and rationed their food with skill he hadn't expected. She organized the cabin with care, adjusting everything so they could reach what they needed fast. She found ways to stretch their supplies. She baked small biscuits that tasted plain but filled the belly. She kept telling Ethan to eat first, and he kept pretending not to notice that she served him more than herself. That evening, Ethan dragged himself back from the barn after another check. Laya sat by the fire with her injured ankle propped on a folded blanket. She watched him carefully as he removed his coat. He couldn't hide the exhaustion this time. His shoulders drooped. His hands shook. He dropped onto the stool by the stove, elbows on his knees, breathing hard. Laya looked at the floor near the stove, then at the bed. She said she didn't want him on the cold ground again. She said if they shared the bed, they didn't need a quilt divider tonight. Her voice carried quiet resolve. Ethan didn't argue. He couldn't. He was too tired and too grateful. Later, after they settled into the bed, neither of them fell asleep right away. The storm had softened outside, but the cabin still felt small under its weight. Laya lay close enough that Ethan felt the warmth of her arm. She whispered his name again. He answered in a voice he hardly recognized, worn down to something soft and vulnerable. She told him she wasn't afraid of the work or the land. She was only afraid of not belonging. Ethan turned toward her slightly and said she belonged here more than she knew. Her breathing steadied then, and she drifted to sleep. Ethan stayed awake a little longer, listening to the quiet storm outside, listening to the woman beside him, realizing that something inside him had already changed. Morning arrived with a silence so complete it made Ethan sit up fast. No pounding wind, no rattling shutters, only the soft tick of the stove cooling and the faint creak of settling logs. Laya stirred beside him, wincing when she shifted her injured ankle. Ethan rose and crossed to the window. He pulled the shutter open just enough to see outside. Sunlight hit the snow so bright it forced him to blink. The world lay still for the first time in days, buried under deep drifts that shaped the land in new curves. He whispered that the storm had finally broken. Laya exhaled a long breath, her shoulders easing in a way he hadn't seen since the night she twisted her ankle. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee, set one beside her, and began dressing for the work ahead. The animals would need checking. The cattle would be scattered. The drifts could be hiding anything. Laya tried to swing her legs over the side of the bed. Pain stopped her cold. Ethan caught her hand before she pushed herself too far. He told her to stay off the ankle. She clenched her jaw like she wanted to argue, but instead she asked him to be careful. He promised he would. Before stepping outside, he leaned forward and kissed her forehead. The moment surprised them both. Her eyes softened, and she nodded once, as if accepting something she had already been quietly hoping for. Ethan saddled his strongest horse and rode out into the valley. Snow reached the horse's chest in places. The cold was sharp now that the wind was gone, and the sun turned the drifts into glittering hills. He found the cattle crowded near the pines, exhausted but alive. 5 had not survived the storm. That loss hit him hard. He stood over them in silence, breath turning thick in the morning air. The remaining animals slipped thin, ribs showing beneath dull coats. Ethan worked for hours, breaking a path for them, leading them toward shelter near the creek, checking each one with stubborn care. His arms shook from effort. His legs felt stiff from the cold. Still, he kept going because all of this meant survival. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, the sun hung low over the ridge. The quiet felt too easy, too still. That was when he heard it. A long howl cut across the valley, followed by another. Ethan turned in the saddle and saw gray shapes moving through the trees. Low and steady wolves, hungry ones. His horse tensed beneath him, ears flicking back. Ethan tightened his grip on the reins. He could reach the cabin if he pushed hard. He could lock the door and wait it out. But the cattle meant food, money, and a future. And now they meant something else. They meant Laya's future, too. He raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the snow. The wolves slowed, but did not scatter. They watched him with bright, calculating eyes. Before Ethan could decide his next move, the cabin door burst open behind him. He spun his horse around, heart hammering. Laya stood on the porch wearing his coat, her sprained ankle brace with cloth and determination. She leaned on a spare rifle, face pale but focused. He rode in fast and reached her before she took a step off the porch. He told her to stay put, voice firm and unshaking. He pointed to the right corner of the cabin and told her to watch that side. Fire only if a wolf slips past me, he said. Laya nodded and braced herself against the rail. The wolves tested them one by one, first a single shadow, then 2, then 4, spreading wider. Ethan stayed mounted, turning his horse to keep the animals from panicking. He fired into the snow near the lead wolf. It leaped back but didn't run. The others widened their circle, waiting for a weak point. Ethan shouted, waved his hat, and drove his horse hard to close the gaps. A young wolf rushed too close, teeth flashing. Ethan fired near its paws. The animal flinched, but another swept in behind it. Suddenly, one wolf darted toward the corner of the cabin where Ethan couldn't reach in time. Laya saw it before Ethan did. She steadied herself, aimed, and fired. The wolf yelped and spun away, wounded but alive. The entire pack hesitated, thrown off balance by the unexpected shot. Ethan looked toward Laya, pride and fear mixed in his chest. He told her no more shots unless he called for them. She swallowed hard and nodded, but her hand stayed steady on the rifle. He fired again, pushing the wolves back. They drifted toward the tree, moving slow and reluctant. The last one paused, met Ethan's stare, then slipped into the shadows. Silence rolled over the valley once the danger passed. Laya swayed on the porch, gripping the railing. Ethan dismounted and reached her just in time to catch her before her knees buckled. She had pushed herself far beyond what her ankle could handle. Inside the cabin, Ethan laid her on the bed and unwrapped her boot. Her ankle had swollen more, the bruising spreading in dark colors across the skin. He packed snow in a cloth and held it gently over the swelling. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. She tried to apologize for being stubborn. Her voice cracked halfway through. Ethan told her not to say sorry, and meant every word. He re-wrapped the brace tight and told her she needed to keep it still. Her eyes shined with pain, but also something deeper, something that looked a lot like trust. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. The room felt small, but the quiet between them felt steady instead of heavy. Laya reached out and touched his knuckles with her fingertips, soft and sure. Ethan looked up. She held his gaze with a mix of fear, hope, and something growing stronger. He told her he cared for her more than he expected, more than made sense after so little time. His voice shook on the last words. Laya breathed out slowly and said she felt the same. Even tried fighting it, but it remained anyway. Ethan asked if he could kiss her. The question came rough but honest. Laya pulled him down gently, kissing him first with caution, then with certainty. It felt like warmth after too many nights of cold silence. When they parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers and let out a shaky laugh that eased something deep inside him. The storm outside might have broken, but something new had begun between them, steady and real. Ethan woke before dawn the next morning to the soft sound of Laya breathing beside him. The storm had faded into memory, leaving the world outside wrapped in deep snow and bright silence. He fed the stove until the fire caught, then poured water into the kettle. When he checked the small calendar tacked behind the shelf, he realized the date, Christmas Eve. He let that settle inside him for a moment. A year ago, he didn't think a day like this would ever hold anything more than work and quiet. Laya stirred and tried to stand, but pain shot through her ankle and forced her back to the bed. Ethan helped her into the chair and propped her foot up with a folded blanket. She watched him move around the cabin, eyes warm but tired. When he stepped out to chop a fresh stack of firewood, she called after him to be careful. He answered with a smile that surprised them both. Later that morning, Ethan returned with armfuls of pine boughs. He set them on the table, unsure what to do with them until Laya guided him. She told him where to place them along the shelves and windows. The fresh scent filled the cabin, mixing with the smell of coffee and warm bread. The place looked softer, almost festive, even though the snow outside was stacked higher than the pour rail. After supper, Ethan pulled out a small wooden box he'd tucked away months earlier. He placed it gently in Laya's lamp. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside lay a folded deed paper with her name written beside his in careful ink. She froze, eyes filling faster than she could blink the tears away. Ethan told her he had written her name on it before she arrived. He wanted her to know she wasn't stepping into a life he owned alone. She was part of it already. No conditions, no bargains. Laya held the paper to her chest. When she looked up, her voice shook, as she said she wanted him to ask her properly, not out of duty or weather or fear. She wanted the truth spoken plain. Ethan felt his heartbeat kick hard. He lowered himself to one knee on the packed earth floor, holding her hands as the firelight flickered across her face. He told her he knew their story started as letters, but what grew between them had become something he wanted for the rest of his life. He told her he wasn't asking for a helper or a partner out of necessity. He was asking for her because she was brave, honest, and stood with him, even when the weather and the world tried to break them. He asked her to marry him with all the hope he had left in him. Laya's shoulders shook as she cried, then laughed through the tears like a weight had lifted. She said yes without hesitation, not because she needs a roof, because she wanted life with him. Ethan gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a warmth he didn't know he was capable of. For the first time in his life, the future felt steady beneath his feet. They married the next morning, Christmas Day. The sky stretched clear and bright, the snow glittering untouched in the early sun. Ethan saddled his best horse and lifted Laya gently in front of him. Her ankle was still wrapped, but she held tight as they rode through the quiet valley toward the Hollis homestead 2 miles away. The cold bit at their cheeks, but they didn't care. They were heading toward the first day of their shared life. Mrs. Hollis flung open the door before they even knocked. She pulled Laya into a warm hug, fussing over her like she had known her for years. Mr. Hollis shook Ethan's hand with a firm grip that carried understanding. They stood by the hearth while simple vows were spoken. No fancy words, no crowd, just honesty and warmth. Ethan said he did, voice strong and certain. Laya said she did with a steady glow in her eyes. Mrs. Hollis cried, wiped her face on her apron, and insisted they sit for stew. The warmth of that small gathering settled into Ethan's bones like a blessing he hadn't expected. The weeks after their wedding were not gentle. Winter didn't soften just because 2 people built a life together. Snowstorms came again. Supplies ran thin. The barn roof needed constant watching. Laya learned the rhythm of the stove and the way the wind changed before snow. Ethan learned the value of sharing burdens instead of carrying them alone. They worked as a team without needing many words. At night, they kept watch by turns. They laughed about burned biscuits and crooked shelves. They argued once about how much hay to spare, then laughed again when they realized neither of them truly knew. But both were trying their best, and through it all, the cabin felt less like shelter and more like home. When spring finally broke through, it came slow and stubborn. The creek thawed first, running dark and loud. Then the snow melted back to reveal patches of brown earth. Calves arrived with shaky legs. Laya planted seeds in rows straight and narrow, determined to coax life from the ground. Ethan fixed the fences, mended the barn, and rebuilt what winter had taken. They worked side by side, steady and sure. On the first warm morning of the year, Ethan took Laya up the ridge overlooking the valley. They sat on a flat rock where the wind moved clean. Below them lay the cabin, the barn, the creek, and the land stretching wide in every direction. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line. The cattle grazed near the pine edge. The world looked open and possible. Ethan wrapped his arm around Laya and told her he could finally see a life worth living here, not just surviving, building, growing. She leaned into him and said she saw it too. They kissed with the sun warming their faces and a spring breeze sweeping over the ridge. That night, the distant howl of a lone wolf carried across the valley. Ethan listened, instinct tightening for a moment. Laya rested her hand on his chest and said they had weathered worse. He nodded, but his hand drifted toward the latch all the same. Danger didn't disappear just because the days grew longer, but facing it together changed everything. They went to bed with summer plans forming and the scent of pine drifting through the shutters. Outside, the land settled into a quiet ready for growth. Ethan lay awake a moment longer, listening to Laya's steady breathing, realizing why this winter had felt different from all the others. He wasn't alone anymore, and he didn't fear the seasons ahead. Together they had learned how to stay, how to build, and how to keep choosing each other no matter the storm.